The lanterns in the great hall smelled of orange peel and wax, a warm sharpness that cut through the damp of the night, but for Vivienne, the smell blurred into one steady ache behind her ribs. Snow hammered the leaded windows like impatient fingers. She had spent the last decade designing small acceptances for strangers in drawing rooms and parlors, arranging marriages and salvageable futures for girls whose families had run out of patience. She had been careful with her heart until it became a formality. Now, standing at the edge of the ballroom, hands clenched around her glove, she felt as if some small domestic compass inside her had lost its north. She said to no one in particular, "I am infertile," the words an internal confession to a body that had been a temple of secrets and medical terms and a litany of late nights with wine and charts. The announcement was not meant for the king, who arrived like a shadow in silk, but the king heard it anyway. He approached with the patience of someone who had been practiced in waiting centuries. When Lucien Moreau smiled, the music quieted a degree, and Vivienne saw, for the first time, the possibility that a declaration could be corrected by a whisper. He leaned close, and the words slipped across the space between them, a soft command disguised as a promise. "Be the mother of my children." The sound was a touch colder than the wax on the lanterns, yet it held a warmth she could not refuse. She had not intended to cross the threshold into that world that evening, a realm where marble corridors remembered names in their veins, and portraits watched like jury members. The child at the far end of the hall was the improbable trigger. The boy was pale as china and too small for his age, named Rowan, as if the housemates insisted on a name tag for the uneasy thing. He crouched beneath the banister, trembling, a thin whimper that tugged at Vivienne in a thread she had thought severed. Servants whispered the word vampire as a curse and an explanation, and some took small steps away, as if gossip were a physical shield. Vivienne moved toward him because there was a maternal muscle in her built out of habit long before biology, trained by orphaned nieces and abandoned wards. When she knelt, the world around her compressed to the proximity of breath. The boy smelled faintly of roses gone to rot and something metallic, like a coin left in damp soil. Vivienne reached across instinct and etiquette and touched his wrist. The bite of cold was immediate, a fizz of electricity that rose like champagne through her fingers and settled in her mouth, as if she had tasted iron dust. The hall spun with the hush of dozens of eyes. The sound closest to her ear was not music, but the king's voice, silk threaded with velvet, explaining that a single taste could tilt futures and order debts no ledger could hold. Lucien, who bore both the title and the arrogance of his station, had long been a rumor in Vivienne's town. He moved with a carriage of centuries and the guile of a patron who had learned which people bend and which break. He told her about the chancellery rules in a baritone that smelled of cedar and rain. A mortal taking sustenance from a vampire created a bond that could not be dissolved by law alone. It was older than their current understanding, older than treaties written in blood and stored in oak chests. He said, "You will be marked, whether you consent or not, if you continue." He explained, in a way that was almost clinical, that the act would give the child a tether to the living world, and the society would owe him status and protection. He also explained the price, which was not coin and not titles. The price would be a kind of motherhood that extended beyond cradle and cradle song, into nights that smelled of iron and the ache of unquiet hunger. The choice cut across the sense Vivienne had of herself, exposing a place where purpose and fear fought like animals in a penned garden. Rowan was the catalyst, and Vivienne accepted on impulse the way one accepts weather. "I will go," she told Lucien, though in truth she had not yet decided. In those moments, the world blurred into a series of sensory glances, the touch of Lucien's ring, cold and heavy on the back of her hand, and the scent of smoke that seemed to linger around him like a personal dusk. The staff of the household, including the matronly housekeeper Margaret, The blunt Dr. Elias Caro, who had once tried to catalog immortality as if it were a condition rather than a culture. The young guard Anton, who kept his loyalty like a coin in a closed palm. And the curator, Madame Sable, who cataloged relics and rumors by moonlight, all watched as if a play had been announced and no one had volunteered to hold the props. Vivienne's decision, small as a broken teacup and as consequential as a law, propelled her out of the hall and into the night. The journey north was both literal and symbolic, a slow passage toward a place where winter sharpened the world into knives of glass. The road glittered, and Vivienne remembered how laughter had once felt natural, a currency she had traded without thinking. Now, each mile measured matters she could not return from. Lucien traveled with a retinue, including the healer Mirren, who smelled of herbs and riverbank earth, Father Marcel, the exiled cleric who had kept odd company with the dead and the living, the seamstress Isla, who mended both hems and hearts, and Mirren's apprentice Jonas, who never stopped watching Vivienne as if she were a problem to be solved. They moved through landscapes where pines threw their hands of needles and ice crusted the ground like the crust on a preserved tart. The manor that would be her temporary home sat on a ridge, its silhouette ragged against the moon. It had the geometry of a bone structure and windows like watchful eyes. Inside were corridors that remembered every whisper, rooms perfumed by old books, and a persistent sweetness like forgotten pastries. It did not ease to be in a house that housed the night. Vivienne catalogued sensations. The way the stair rail trembled under her palm, the chill in the air that was not just cold but a presence, the slight metallic taste in the tea Lucien offered like an apology, the way glass reflected not faces but histories. She found herself listening for a pulse more than a clock. In the first week, the child, Rowan, became a study in contradictions. He had moments of monstrous hunger when his eyes went liquid and the clockwork of the house seemed to pulse toward the scent of blood, and moments of almost human vulnerability when he smelled of warm bread and the soft nuzzle of a stray cat. Vivienne learned the rhythms of his sleep and the small signs of his body. She discovered a narrow scar at the base of his throat like a miniature shield, and a toy soldier that he clutched in sleep, which she polished with a damp cloth. Each object was a knot in the rope tying him to the living world and to her. The rituals began slowly, and then with the speed of a turning tide. There were feeding nights, each conducted with a ceremony that mixed etiquette and ancient rules. Lucien oversaw these as if presiding over a court. He taught Vivienne the order of offerings, the correct posture of hands, how to set a cup, how to close her mouth around the metallic tang without letting fear dictate the rhythm. He said the bite should be given carefully, with consent that functioned like a pact, and he showed her how to perform the binding ritual that wrapped a living heart around a nascent vampire spirit. On the first night, Vivienne hesitated. Her hand shook as she lifted the cup of warm iron, rich with her own blood. "Let me talk," Rowan said, in a voice that did not match his age. "I am afraid." The dialogue that followed was slow and long and intimate in a way that tightened Vivienne's chest and unloosed memories like a string of beads. She spoke of being a child who had learned to arrange life for others, of a mother who had pressed her forehead against a fevered brow and told stories to stop the shivering, of years of clinical tests with Dr. Caro and the sterile salt of disappointment. Rowan told her of nights when the other children had left him in the attic, and of mornings when he had pretended to sleep so that the others would not look at him. His lips. Lucien watched and occasionally murmured clarifications about the ritual, but mostly he listened with an intensity that felt like ownership. The dialogue sequences between Vivienne and Lucien expanded into a small court. They argued over the ethics of bonding, the nature of parenthood in a house of the night, and the real meaning of immortal debt. There were nights when Vivienne asked, "What is the end for someone like you, who does not grow old?" Lucien answered, "I collect endings and call them stories." He said, "You will not stop being your own person." He said, You will be given a gift and cursed with a hunger that will test the edges of who you are. Vivienne questioned whether motherhood could be something elected and shaped rather than merely a biological imposition. Lucien continued, "The bond does not rob you of choice, it sharpens it." When Vivienne pressed on the subject of children she had never had, he softened and said, "Be honest with me about why you said you were infertile." She admitted that she had declared it in rooms full of doctors and relatives, as much to stop the prodding as to admit a private grief. She said, "I wanted to keep something for myself, to have a door I could close." Lucien listened as if he were learning a new language, as if her confession gave him a map. The intimacy of these exchanges made Vicinus resolve waver and strengthen at alternating pulses. There were also scenes of tenderness and violence that were inseparable. In one intense scene, the ritual required that Vivienne taste Rowan's blood to seal his tether to life. The descriptions of sensation had to be exact to honor the tradition she had stepped into. She described the smell first, an undercurrent of copper beneath something sweet like overripe cherries. The taste hit next, metallic but not wholly unpleasant, a warmth that spread up her arm and into her jaw as if a candle had been lit beneath her sternum. Every nerve in her body answered with a battery of responses, a wave of nausea, a surprising rush of clarity, a small opening in the part of her heart that had been cemented over with time. The feel of his pulse at her fingertips was that of a fledgling animal, fierce and erratic, and when she wrapped her mouth around his wrist to test the vein, she felt the skin tremble like a new leaf. The scene was filled with sensory layers, the scratch of silk on the table, the smell of melted wax, the hum of the hearth, the soft clink of porcelain, all underscored by the quiet, heavy breathing of witnesses. The ritual ended with Rowan asleep and Vivienne with a new ache that was neither entirely physical nor wholly emotional. Expanding the backstory was necessary to explain why Vivienne would agree to such a thing. Her childhood had been stitched together from 2 houses and the smell of laundry. She had been the eldest of 3, the one who learned to ration hope like bread. Her mother had died when Vivienne was 19, leaving behind knitting patterns and a small ledger of debts, and her father had retreated into silence. She learned to translate grief into domestic order. In her youth, she had trained as a governess, and later as a matchmaker, because that role allowed her to still the tremor of loss with purpose. The surgeon, Dr. Caro, had once told her, in a tone both clinical and oddly tender, that the tests showed irregularities in her reproductive profile, irregularities that might be treated, but not easily. Vivienne remembered the sterile rooms, the sound of the machine like distant surf, the whiteness of everything, and the palpably mundane phrase, "You can try, but do not count on certainty." Those memories framed her present. A puzzle piece slid into place, not out of romantic desire, but from a pragmatic hunger for belonging and meaning. There were 3 moments of acute tension that reshaped the course of things. The first came when the chancellery of the vampires arrived to inspect the binding. They wore robes that were more tradition than fabric, faces lined by law and older obligations. The inspection felt like being judged by a tribunal of ancestors. Vivienne stood before them as if her throat were a ledger to be balanced. They demanded proof that Rowan would be protected and that the bond would not upset the delicate treaties between mortals and immortals. The scene brimmed with the smell of ink and old book glue and a ceremonial bell that sounded like a heart being struck. Vivienne had to decide whether to reveal secrets about Lucien the chancellery might find compromising. She chose to speak truthfully about the terms she had agreed to and to claim Rowan as part of her household. The second moment came when Anton the guard discovered an illegal potion in the servant's chest, a venom traded by an exiled baron for favors. The potion smelled of bitter orange and iron, and its presence suggested betrayal. Vivienne confronted the servants, including Margaret and Isla, and fingers pointed in quick succession, as if accusation could be contagious. The third moment of tension occurred when Rowan, newly tethered and confused, attempted to slip from the house in search of other children, was nearly taken by traveling hunters who mistook him for prey. Mirren and Father Marcel raced through a midnight smog to pull him back, and Vivienne found herself running with a lantern, breath fogging like ghosts, and the knowledge of how thin their protection could be pressed into her like a warning. The conflict widened as other figures became more concrete in the narrative. There was Madame Sable, who catalogued relics and kept a ledger of debts with names that opened old wounds. The Baron Casimir, who claimed kinship through old treaties and wanted to influence the upbringing of any new reigns of power. And Jonas, who watched Vivienne with a scientist's mind and a young man's heart that misread kindness as invitation. Each secondary character had motives and textures. Madame Sable pressed for tradition and lineage to be preserved. Father Marcel negotiated the spiritual implications, murmuring about redemption and exile. Dr. Caro offered attempts at a cure as much as he could, explaining in methodical detail the steps he would take to try to reverse the tether should it become pathological. He described blood testing, the salines and serums he might attempt, and a ritual he had heard of from an old text that required moonflower tincture and 3 nights of fasting. The explanation was clinical, yet edged with superstition, about 300 characters of methodical process that made the search for cure feel plausible and reachable. As the bond with Rowan deepened, so did the complications. Vivienne began to feel the pull of a hunger she had not expected. It was not the savage craving she had pictured in novels, but an acerbic gnaw that asked to be acknowledged. The town noticed changes in her days and nights. Letters arrived from her sisters Agatha and Lucille, who both judged and pleaded from across a distance measured in propriety and gossip. They feared exile and social scandal. When a hunter named Riker came calling with a fevered sense of justice and a hunger for trophies, tensions peaked. Conversation with him became a trial. He said, "You have betrayed nature, keeping such a thing in your house." Vivienne answered, "He has no protector but me." The exchanges were long, each line a nail in the making of a verdict that could exile them or save them. Riker accused Lucien of corruption and Vivienne of theft against the natural order. Lucien replied in a calm that made the thunder outside feel like a sideshow. "You judge what you do not understand." The council convened and debated the nature of parenthood in their tradition. There were threats of exile for Vivienne and demands for proof that the child would not become a plague. These conversations required multiple exchanges and re-examinations of evidence, each person presenting a different moral frame. The consummation of the bond was an event in the middle of the house that resembled a domestic liturgy. It mixed the erotic language of intimacy and the cold clinicality of ritual. There was the moment when Vivienne gave the first deliberate bite, not as an act of ownership, but as a statement of commitment. The sensory record of that night is dense and layered. The taste of Rowan was warm iron and something sweeter that Vivienne could not name, like the memory of a lullaby sung in a language she did not speak. Her hands recorded the texture of his hair, the tremor of his jaw, the faint salt at the corner of his mouth. Lucien watched with an expression that was not purely of the hunter or the sovereign, but of a man who had made peace with the idea that power requires sacrifice. There was music, the scrape of a bow, and the hiss of the hearth. Afterwards, intimacy had consequences. Vivienne felt a tether curl inside her as if a string had been tied to her heart and then hung across the house to a point beyond her sight. The sensation was thrilling and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff with an invitation to fly. The consequences took shape quickly. Vivienne found herself waking at strange hours with the compulsion to walk the corridors and check doors, to arrange toys and soothe phantom cries. Her hands moved as if by ritual, tidying and naming and protecting in small ways that made the house safer. But hunger can be contagious in social systems. Rumors grew in the town below the manor and among the chancellery that Vivienne was changing, that the old restraint had cracks leading to a dangerous expansion. Leaks in trust emerged, and the Baron Casimir used them. sowing doubt that perhaps Lucien was not noble in his intentions, that his promise of redemption was a pretense for consolidating power through mortal bonds. Vivienne began to search for a cure, not because she wished to escape the bond, but because Rowan deserved a choice when he grew older. Dr. Caro, earnest and methodical, proposed an approach that balanced science with ritual. The plan required 3 phases. First, a series of blood assays to map the unique compounds introduced during the tether. Second, an application of a neutralizing serum partially derived from moonflower tincture that would need testing over a moon cycle. And third, a ceremony to reweave the bond if the serum succeeded. Each phase involved detailed steps and precautions, with Mirren preparing herbal compounds, Jonas collecting samples, and Father Marcel providing spiritual oversight to ensure that no harm came of the attempt. The procedural description ran about 300 characters, a compact technical node in the story that made the search for a cure credible. There were betrayals. Margaret, the housekeeper, had secrets of her own. She had been in service to Lucien for decades and had seen the way attachments shifted allegiances. At one point, she hid a vial of the Baron Casimir's poison as an insurance policy. Vivienne discovered this in a confrontation that was less theatrical and more domestic, as Margaret stood in the kitchen with flour on her apron and confessed with a voice that had been softened by years of keeping other people's secrets. The scene expanded into a long exchange where Margaret explained her fear of losing the household if the chancellery judged them. She said, "We protect what we have." Vivienne answered, "Protection is not the same as possession." The awkwardness in their conversation was a measure of how intimacy and mistrust can coexist in the same room, neither fully winning. At the height of the conflict, Lucien fell ill in a way nothing had predicted. He did not age, but he weakened. His skin paled with a threat that the court could not interpret. He coughed, a sound more human than anyone present at the manor had heard from him in a century. The wound was metaphysical as well as physical, a corruption of the tether possibly introduced by the Baron or the hunters, or some older curse. This collapse inverted the balance of power overnight and forced Vivienne into a role that she had not sought. She was no longer a tentative guardian, but a responsible party in the saving of the man who had asked her to be mother. The urgency focused the household into movement. Mirren and Dr. Caro ran tests. Father Marcel sought spiritual counsel with entreaties that sounded older than the house, and Jonas tore through archives looking for precedent. The search for cure became a race against time, with moments of tension that needed their own careful breathing space. Vivienne stood in a corridor, remembering the first test results, the smell of reagents and old vellum, and the feeling of being too small before something implacable. She recalled a conversation with Lucia, her sister, who had finally arrived, bringing with her the social weight of the town and the sharp reproofs of decency. Lucia said, "If you do not stop this, you will lose yourself to a superstition." Vivienne answered through clenched teeth, "I have already lost what time would have given me." These lines, brief and staccato, captured how choices curve the rest of a life. The finale demanded a resolution that balanced risk and redemption. The cure, as Dr. Caro proposed, required the moonflower serum combined with a ritual of unbinding that would be performed by Father Marcel and Mirren under a new moon. The ritual called for 3 components. 1. The acceptance of the tether by the mortal, acknowledged by a public naming. 2. The neutralizing serum administered in 3 doses over a single night. 3. The symbolic severing and reweaving of the bond, represented by burning a lock of hair and feeding the smoke into the open palm of the bound. The technical description was terse yet precise and readable, about 250 to 350 characters long, and it resonated with the practical and ceremonial. When the night came, the house gathered under a sky scrubbed clean by wind. The ritual was dramatic and intimate and dangerous in equal measures. Vivienne took the serum and felt it spread like a cool fog through her veins. The ritual demanded that she accept the possibility of losing the tether, and in doing so, risk Rowan slipping into a solitude she could not remedy. She chose to act because the child deserved the possibility of choosing his own future. The ceremony lasted until dawn. Lucien, weakened but present, watched and offered the smallest of smiles, like a promise renewed. The smoke of the burning lock of hair curled into the air and made patterns that looked like hands. In the end, the serum did its work to the degree they hoped. The bond changed its shape rather than dissolving entirely. It remained as a cord, but one that could be cut by consent rather than by law. After the ritual, the household had to negotiate new terms. Some left, like the Barren, who saw his leverage lost, and some stayed, like Margaret, who had been forgiven for her earlier concealment, and who now insisted on building a nursery in a small room that looked out on the garden. Vivienne adapted to a life that braided the domestic with the fantastic. The town below slowly unraveled suspicion when they saw Vivienne stepping into market stalls, carrying parcels, and conversing like any woman who had taken in a child. She taught Rowan to speak the names of things that belonged to the human world, and he taught her to listen for nocturnal music that she had not known existed. 1 month later, Vivienne found that the nights were less sharp. The tether hummed quietly, and she no longer woke with a jaw ache from imagined cravings. She had begun to feel an odd, steady heat in her palms in the mornings when Rowan hugged her goodbye. People in the village who had whispered began to nod with cautious approval. Dr. Caro sent a letter reporting blood assays that suggested the serum had partially rebalanced the compounds introduced by the bond. He recommended continued monitoring but allowed optimism. Margaret had placed a small wooden soldier on the mantel. Vivienne polished it every evening until its paint gleamed. She cried sometimes at small things, like the first time Rowan laughed aloud at a joke he made about a hat that would not fit him. Those tears tasted of salt and a relief so profound it felt like drowning into shore. 3 months later, the household had shifted into the rhythm of a shared life. Lucien recovered to a degree that allowed him to preside at more dinners and to answer letters that arrived like small petitions. He and Vivienne had a conversation one night in which he confessed some of his older fears about immortality. He said, "Immortality is boring if you never risk." Vivienne responded, "Parenthood is not an experiment." The exchange was brief but full of meaning, and their relationship moved from the transactional to something more fragile and real. Rowan began to attend lessons with Jonas and Isla and took to learning the manual crafts as a way to feel physically part of the world. The children in the town who had been skeptical began to visit, drawn by curiosity and perhaps by the novelty of a child who did not adhere strictly to daylight. 6 months after the ritual, a small celebration was held. The house had repaired a number of its broken tiles and hung fresh curtains. Vivienne had taken to sleeping less and feeling more awake in a way that was not exhaustion, but choice. She spent afternoons in the garden teaching Rowan to plant bulbs, speaking to him as if he were both child and fellow traveler. The tether remained, but it had become part of a larger fabric that included friends and faults and hope. The Chancery had issued a tempered decree acknowledging the precedent and granting limited protections, but urging careful oversight. Vivienne received letters from her sisters that were kinder now, and Dr. Caro sent his best regards with a parcel of salves. The community had expanded, and so had the house, now warmer and messier with toys and books. In the end, Vivienne learned that motherhood had many definitions, and that the price for choosing to love a child who came from a world that was not wholly hers would be ongoing negotiation and sacrifice. She had given and had been given, and the exchange had not impoverished either. Her life moved forward, not as a return to what had been, but as the cultivation of something new. She kept the toy soldier on the mantel as a symbol of the small daily acts that make family. She kept Lucien's whisper in her ear as both a promise and a warning. She kept the memory of the first taste like a pebble in her pocket to remind her that some choices mark you forever. If you want to keep following Vivienne's story and to be part of a community that unpacks the cost and grace of choices like hers, please tell us how you would have acted in her place. Did you find the decision brave, reckless, selfish, or inevitable? Start your comment with "I would" or "I would not" and explain in a few lines why. Your voice shapes the next episodes and helps us decide what threads to pull on in future tales. When you share your thought, you help create a space where we can analyze the ethics of immortality, the legitimacy of chosen families, and the social repercussions of taking in what others fear. We read every comment and use them to craft follow-ups that dive deeper into the lore and the hearts of these characters. And now, let us return to the house where a whisper has become a life, because Vivienne's choice has only just begun to ripple in ways she could never have predicted. The final scenes were quieter, but no less charged. Vivienne sat with Lucien in a room lined with portraits that watched like a patient jury. They spoke of exile and redemption, and of the cost of keeping a child alive in a world that preferred tidy borders. Lucien placed a hand over hers and said, "You altered my kingdom, and in doing so, you altered me." Vivienne replied, "You asked for motherhood, and you gave me a covenant I did not know I could hold." Their conversation folded into the larger arc of the house and its keepers. Margaret reopened a trunk of linens and found a lace headdress that belonged to Vivienne's grandmother and presented it to Vivienne as a symbol of continuity. Dr. Caro proposed a research grant to study the partial reversal they had achieved, offering a bridge between medical practice and ritual. Jonas petitioned for a place to study folklore and catalogued the ways in which human habit and immortal practice intersected. Each person found a small redemption in the new order. In the hush of a late evening, Vivienne watched Rowan sleep and felt a calm like settled water, a steadiness that testified to the particular geometry of their lives. She thought of the choices that had led her here, of the cold ring Lucien had laid upon her hand in the ballroom, and the whisper that had seemed ridiculous and impossible, and yet had become a promise made flesh. The house did not relinquish its secrets, nor did the world outside, but inside she had carved a space where a child could be taught the names of both day and night. She had learned to accept that love in this world might require a kind of translation from hunger into care. The final echo of the story was small and clear, like a bell. She had been infertile by some measures, but in accepting to mother the children of darkness, she had found her own unexpected fertility, not of body alone, but of purpose and belonging. If you stayed to the end, if you keep staying, subscribe to walk with us through the corridors that memory and myth share.